The time is 1:31. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Agriculture and Natural Resources Budget Committee today. Since our budgets are all completed, we're going to continue to have informational hearings on issues that have come before us this session. And so without further ado, if Senator Titus could come forward and give us an update on the Water Task Force and, you know, what's been happening since you guys started meeting. So welcome to committee.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to present today. Do you have a clicker? So what I'll kind of do today is walk through how we've set up the task force, and then I'll just step you through our goals and the work we've accomplished and kind of where we're headed to give you a roadmap, and then I'm happy to answer any questions after that. So thank you. As we start out, I kind of start and end with a historical picture just to give us some context. I know when Gary's out in the wheat field, he probably is dressed like that with his nice shoes and hat and everything, but most folks don't do that anymore. But it's an interesting picture, one, to see how big a deal this was for the community to have an irrigation canal for winter wheat west of Dodge City. But the fact that they had an open irrigation canal for winter wheat west of Dodge City tells us an awful lot about what folks were thinking about water and its potential 115 years ago. So the Water Task Force was established by HB 2172 last year. It ended up as a 13-member task force. You may remember there were a lot of people that want their voice heard in water. At one point, there were somewhere around 30 members potentially on that task force. We've whittled it down to an almost manageable number, but we have pretty good representation across the board. One of the things I always note about this is there was a pretty strong feeling that if the task force was going to do meaningful work, it needed to be led by legislators so that we could do the work and then bring that back to you and the Senate and push forward some of these ideas and be able to talk about them. So the other thing is it's not all just folks that have been involved in Water Committee or Senate Ag or House Ag. We have a little broader representation on there. We have some members who are on the appropriations committees because some of these questions come down to dollars, and if we don't have good voices on the appropriations committee to talk about our work, it can be difficult to get some of those things funded. Along with our legislative members, we have a good mix of non-legislative stakeholders. Of course, all the major water agencies are represented in the task force here with Health and Environment, DWR, and the Water Office. But we have large and small municipalities with Wichita and KMU. Evergy's represents some of the energy concerns. Heidi Mell is with the Nature Conservancy. We have the Western Groundwater Management Districts with Shannon Kenyon, and kind of our commercial industrial person is Karma Mason. So we have a good array of views and different perspectives on how water works. A lot of history in these water programs over the last couple of decades there as well. And the other thing we've been intentional is, as I mentioned, we couldn't fit everybody on the task force that wanted a voice, but we have worked to bring in some of these other groups, allow them to make sure we hear their points of view and understand their concerns. So, for example, we had the tribal nations in Kansas come into one of our meetings and provide their perspective because they occupy a unique place between state and federal water laws. So we've been taking a broad look at that. As far as the bill itself and what we're supposed to spend our time doing, you can really summarize it in these three major objectives. The first is to evaluate the major risks to the quality and quantity of the state's water supply. And a big component of that, when we do that, what's the economic impact to some of those supply levels? The next is to identify steps we need to take to define and achieve a future supply of water. And then the third is to take a look at our current funding and determine if that is sufficient for future needs. As part of the overall task force, we also created a working group. And that working group has a little more specific tasks to get into the weeds. And we made sure that group is made up of sort of our professionals that deal in water, engineers, geologists, environmental scientists, planners, attorneys that deal in these areas. And their specific task is to review the Water Planning Act. So that's the set of statutes. It doesn't get a lot of attention compared to the Water Appropriation Act, but the Planning Act is what creates the Water Authority, authorizes a state water plan, sets priorities. Those programs, those surface water programs that the Water Office runs out of our reservoirs, all of that is in the Water Planning Act. And so those pieces started to come together in the early to late 60s. For those that were involved a long time ago, there was originally a Water Resource Board that predated the Water Office. So that was modernized and the Water Authority was created. But after the 80s, those statutes have pretty much remained unchanged. There's been some tweaks along the way, but when we look at some of the priorities that are in there, they're either too vague to be helpful or the way we think about water has changed. So, and that applies to the whole planning process. And so we thought a really good use of these folks' time would be to take a deep dive into that, say, what are other states doing? What are best practices? If we really are going to pour a lot of money into water, which has been kind of the direction, we need to make sure we're prioritizing the right things. We have transparency, we have accountability, and one of my primary goals is to come away from that process to be able to hand everybody a restructured system that says, you know, we've put the checks and balances in place so you can trust the money's going to be spent wisely once we're ready to make that commitment. But we have a preliminary report that'll come out sometime during this legislative session, and I'll show you how we split up our work. But this first report will mainly include the risks we've identified, and then as we move into year 2, we'll get into the other 2 questions of the task force for the report. Final report will be due next legislative session. So our task force work to date, the first question we undertook was to study those risks and some of those future supply and economic impacts. And this was, in some ways, this was the easier part because our agencies have been dealing with this for a long time, right? Every day they're trying to solve the problem. So a lot of the data was there. It was just bringing it together so the committee could review it, view it all together in one picture. And then we're still taking some information on some issues. We didn't get to everything, but we worked through, for the most part, what we consider sort of the main problems. And I always get the question about really specific items, but you know, the task force really is, we're working on a big framework, right? We're not going to have the time to go in and solve all of the ground level problems, but we want to build a framework that can support that. The ongoing stage we're in now is really reviewing the planning process. So we had one day of meetings where the agency came in and they ran through how the Water Authority works, how it recommends budgets, how they develop the water plan. We got a really good feel for how Kansas operates. And then we had a second meeting where we contrasted that with other states. We had Colorado, Texas, and California come in and talk all about their planning processes. Our subgroup is looking at even more states. We can't go through everything as the big group, but the subgroup is looking, they're even looking at eastern states. So we typically divide water between basically Great Plains West has what we call prior appropriation and Western water law, and to the east, they manage their water differently. But that doesn't mean they don't have, you know, project lists and planning ideas that we maybe haven't thought about. So we're casting a broad net. The last phase, which we will hopefully get underway this spring after the legislative session, is to take a look at the funding sources. Is there a long-term source of funding that we could identify? And then maybe take a look at agency organization, priorities for the water plan, and things like that. So one of the things that I'll always share is with the, you know, we've had different proposals for funding over the years, but working with Representative Minix, who's the co-chair, we want to make sure we bring a viable plan to the legislature. We don't want to just suggest the most expensive option because we want to see all these things done. We want to bring forth something that legislators can really work with. So that's going to be the focus of our discussions. This is just a little more detail about our findings, and I'll share when we went through the risks. You know, you guys, I'm sure, have heard enough. The two of the three major risks are pretty clear. They've been in the discussion for quite a while. We have the declining groundwaters in western Kansas and the reservoir sedimentation that's draining our capacity in eastern Kansas. From my perspective, I'm optimistic because of the work we've done the last couple of years. We're seeing major progress on those issues. With the groundwater out west, we had House Bill 2279, which gave the groundwater districts very specific charges, identify all the areas with less than 50 years of life of water left, and then go out and develop a local response to that. And the response just needs to be a reasonable response. It isn't make everything balanced tomorrow. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that some districts had done better over the years on their own. Some districts had not done very much. But in those areas where we hadn't seen as much action, they've engaged with this on a serious level. They've identified the areas, and we're seeing real plans, right? It's not all happening overnight, but if we get on a 15 or 20-year track to get to a level of stability, that's a huge improvement over the conversations we were having even 5 years ago. So I feel like we've made real progress, and we were able to set up the locals to be successful in that. So we will see their plans on July 1st when they come to the chief engineer, but I think we're making good progress there. We're also being creative with our reservoirs. We have the injection dredging project at Tuttle Creek Reservoir, so that's where we're shooting jets of water in front of the dam, basically creates a current through a channel. It stirs up sediment, and the gates are open, and it releases the sediment downstream, frees up space, restores that stream, as far as we can tell, to a more natural prairie river type state anyway. If that, we're gonna do a couple more seasons of testing with the Corps of Engineers, but assuming those reports come out well, this is a really cost-efficient way to free up space. I know we've started to set aside money to try a similar project at the reservoirs where the gates are at a different level, and you can't do it quite the same way, but you can still sort of create that current, and you run a pipe around the dam, and you can push that sedimentation and the water, you can push it out similar way, but it just takes a little extra step. So this is really a good step forward for us in this regard. The other issue that's really come up in the discussions was the risk to our public water suppliers. And I think we're all familiar with aging infrastructure. Every town that has 100-year pipes underneath downtown, and they start breaking, and it's an expensive proposition to fix all that. We've had the lead pipe issues in different parts of the country. And we've started to address that. When we put in the grant programs in 2302, KDHE's had programs over the years. We put some ARPA money into it. I think we finally acknowledged this is an important part of how we need to be spending water, because getting water to all of our users, residential, commercial, industrial, that's safe and of high quality is important. So we're starting to address that as we work through problems. And the other issue that's come up is that water quality from the sources of supply for a lot of our municipalities. You have your uranium problems in a lot of the western and northwest streams, and nitrates have become a real problem, especially for small towns. I always give the example, I have a town in my district that drilled a new well about 5 years ago. They tested it. The test hole didn't show any problems with nitrate levels or anything else. They get the well in, and within a year, they figure out it's contaminated with nitrates. And most of the year now, they can't provide that water to their citizens. Town about 850 people. And so while they're still paying off the debt for putting in that new well, their new solution is to tie in with the rural water district, and they'll mix the water, bring down the nitrate levels so that they can still distribute it. The problem is that solution costs about $5.5 million, and the well is within the rural water well they'll be drawing from is within a mile of the contaminated well. So we can't say for sure that there won't be additional contamination at some point in the future, and we've built up all this money. So we're pushing some things to look at regionalization and things like that that'll help with this process. But this is, and as the EPA adjusts levels on these different chemicals, we see this as being really the major challenge and the major fiscal challenge going forward. I'll say we'll probably will never have enough money to solve all of these problems at a state level, but we need to start putting frameworks in place for how we're going to deal with them if we want to provide water supplies. As far as actual meeting dates, since then we had 2 meetings online this summer. We went out to Dodge City for 2 days. We had a meeting in Topeka. That's where we talked about the planning I mentioned. We met once in Manhattan, and then the work group has been meeting every month, and we'll meet through session. It was interesting when we compared the other states, because they all have fairly different, even though we have somewhat similar laws, they all have very different approaches in how they plan, how top-down they are, how bottom-up they are. It's interesting, you look at a state like California, their water agencies come up with their plan, and they come up with a whole project list, and they go to the legislature and say, well, it'll cost us $2 billion to implement this plan. The California legislature issues $2 billion in bonds, gives it to the agency, and they're off to build their projects, and the legislature pays or doesn't pay off those, whatever the California legislature does. We're obviously not going to recommend we go that route in Kansas, but I just always share that example because it's such, Texas has a sales tax they dedicate They actually had to do a constitutional amendment to put a sales tax in place to pay for water projects. Colorado's a mix. They have different funding sources with oil and gas revenues. Some of their marijuana money may go as well, and they kind of hodgepodge it together. It looks more like what we do, but there's a lot of different methods that are used to fund those sources and how they push out funds and what that process looks like. So next steps for us as a task force, we're not meeting during the legislative session with so many legislators. We obviously have enough to do here. Our work group is meeting during session though, and at least monthly to try and get caught up on their work. And our goal is we'll be requesting some, hopefully we'll get 2 more days to meet here before the end of the fiscal year. And the idea is our first meeting after session will be a joint meeting with the work group. They've been looking at that Water Planning Act and are working through it. Hopefully they'll bring us kind of a, here's what we think best practices are. We should look at reforming Kansas in this way. Here's kind of a draft bill, and we'll have kind of a roundtable discussion. We like this, we don't like this. Can you look at this? Why don't you try this? We'll send the work group off to kind of finish what would be a draft bill for us to present later on, and then the task force can move on to the discussions about funding and organization and some of those other efficiencies. And ideally, that'll give us a final report that's ready to go sometime in the fall of 2026. And then I'll end with this historical picture. This is from 1914. This is a very idealistic version of what Ness City might have been like had we built that giant canal from the edge of the Rockies there in South Dakota. But it shows you, again, this is how much people believed water was a key part of the economy and what they thought was possible. So, and I think we still look at water in that way when we look at our ag economy and all of these new data centers and things like that. It may not look like the Walnut River at Ness City, but certainly those things still remain with us today. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Senator Titus. Any questions for the senator regarding the Water Task Force? Representative Alcala.
Wear our hair the same. Hey, are we and I should know this, but I don't, are we trucking in water in western Kansas?
I've not heard that in western Kansas. You know, there have been times where there have been communities in short-term needs where they have had to truck in water. Typically, the few historical examples I'm aware of, it usually becomes a problem in southeast Kansas first because they have very little groundwater supply. And when they get into an intense drought, the reservoirs in that part of the state are smaller. And so their sources dry up faster. So that's been my experience, is it's typically a southeast Kansas issue. Not to say that it hasn't been done on a short-term basis somewhere, though.
Any idea when that happens, guesstimate on how many gallons or truckloads we bring in?
I would guess you could do, I don't know. You could see we know the stats of the gallon per use of every municipality in the state, and you could work that out to get a rough estimate of what they need for normal operations.
I just wondered if you knew off the top of your head. I was just curious, so. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Further questions? Representative Roth, did you have one?
Just a comment, that first picture on the page. When I was a child, a long time ago, we used to walk the prairies when you could just walk anywhere you wanted to. And actually, we found a lot of cool stuff out there that fell out of probably these people's pockets and the pockets of people that worked on the canal out there. And so that brings back a lot of memories to me. So thank you for sharing that photo. And in southeast Kansas, I believe you were talking about Caney, Kansas, where because of deferred maintenance, nobody had water. All the pipes were leaking and broken. I think they're working on that now. So
That's right, yeah.
Representative Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator Titus, for being here today. I always find it amazing how technology is changing and changing so fast, you know. And we talk about dedicated source of spending for our water problems in Kansas. We're looking at things like Q-Stable that will allow farmers to identify their own particular Q-Stable factor for them to see what they need to do individually to help with this problem. Things like this electromagnetic flying surveys for 3D mapping and to map the aquifers. You know, that wasn't available 10 years ago, and that stuff costs money. And so those things are coming along, and I assume they'll continue to come along as technology changes to help us all. So I just wanted to comment that when we spend our money, it's for things like that, and I think it's really making a huge difference. So.
Representative White.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the great presentation, Senator. On the water qualities, you touched on nitrates and uranium, but you skipped over PFAS. Can you share with us any discussions you guys might have had on PFAS?
It's been at a high level. We had seen some heat maps on some of these chemicals that, you know, some of them have been, they tend to concentrate downstream from military installations. It seems that McConnell in Wichita has a pretty hot area of groundwater below them. There's a little bit below Fort Riley, but they're there, but they're not at levels that violate drinking water standards. And so I think we're learning more, right? There are a lot of these chemicals. I think the EPA is looking at all the forever chemicals, you know, that come up. And I think if I were to project right now we're aware of it, but I don't know that there's any immediate actions. But long term, if we start classifying some of these as unsafe and then setting lower levels, what we'll see is in a lot of communities that have been operating for a number of decades, right, it's going to throw their drinking water supply out of compliance. And how do you respond to that, right? Do you have to upgrade the water plant? How much does that cost? How many communities is this hitting all at once? And, you know, the way the federal EPA swings back and forth, it's hard to project what that could mean, when it might happen. But if we do see a big shift in policy or the science moves to a point where we're saying we've got to clean this up, we should be thinking about how do we want to respond to that. I think that's part of the charge for sure.
Thank you for that answer, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions for Senator Titus? I have a couple. The working group of professionals, how many are there, and how were those individuals decided upon?
I believe there are 5, and co-chair Minix and I selected the members, per the bill, selected the members of that committee. So if I get them right off the top of my head, we have Tom Stiles, who was the former director of water at the Bureau of Health, or Bureau of Water at Health and Environment. We have Stephanie Kramer, who is the chief counsel at the Department of Ag. We have Matthew Buller, who is a private attorney for Fulston Siefkin. He's been involved. He represented Hayes in their litigation. He typically represents water right owners. For some perspective, Susan Metzger, who's the director of the Kansas Water Institute at K-State, is on that board. And I feel like, who am I forgetting? And Chris Badel, who is the, what is Chris's title? I don't know. Program manager for water management. The program water for management at DWR. So we have a good mix of engineers, natural scientists. But yeah, Senator Representative Minix and I selected those. We thought they were well qualified.
So my little neighbor Stephanie will be writing up the legislation, probably?
I heard she's already done a comprehensive markup and shared it with the working group. So she's doing exactly what we hoped.
Any word on the dredging report from Tuttle?
The last report I had was that they did one run through. It was deemed successful. There were no, they created the channel, it moved sediment, and there were no adverse impacts on wildlife downstream. So as I understand it, the next they're going to do, we wanted to get 3 seasons, and I think they have to do, I think it's a summer and a spring, I think, are what we need to do. Or maybe fall and spring, but they want to just make sure on that when you put that sedimentation back in the river. So we're talking about the Blue River that goes down to the Kansas out of Tuttle. That hasn't had sedimentation like it originally did since the dam was built. It's much clearer than it ever ran before that, and so they just want to make sure that it doesn't harm any wildlife downstream. So the first test is good, and I'd been told before that they didn't anticipate, when they talked it through with their biologists, they didn't anticipate it causing problems. They said, in fact, it'll make this stretch of the river friendlier to native prairie species than it has been for a long time because it's too clean for the types of fish and things that would have lived there prior to the dam. So long-term, it might actually serve to be kind of a restoration project, but we'll see what we get. Hopefully by this time and next year, we'll have a clearer picture of that.
We've been talking about getting a report, and maybe some other water agencies can address that. But as, you know, if you're going to get a preliminary report from what happened last fall, the committee would like to have an update on that. However, you can measure 1 or 2, you know, working times. So, Ranking Carlin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry I was late. It's too much going on, but just now what you said about, and I think as I came in, you were talking about how we move the water. Do we know what the speed of that water movement is, or are they measuring that? And are we saying that maybe that it continues to move it faster through the other streams, or where does it stop?
We would measure that in cubic feet per second, and usually we can control that by how open the gates are on the dam to let the water out, right? You lower them to slow down the flow. What the actual numbers are there, I don't have that knowledge.
I wouldn't know what the numbers meant, but I followed it during the floods. But, you know, I'm just saying, I hadn't thought about it till what I heard you say, that the water continues to move at a little bit faster because of the pressure, probably. And I didn't know if that was going to, so does that improve? Are you saying the Blue River might have been improved by this? Is that what you
Maybe.
said?
I'm neither a biologist nor a hydrologist, so I would caution that. But my understanding is it's not necessarily going to increase the rate of flow. The way they're sort of carving out a channel is that the water will naturally flow out with the sediment in it, not necessarily move out faster and pick up
But
sediment.
it doesn't, well, okay. So if the water was still, it might give it a little more of a push, but we don't know. Okay, we don't know. That's
I
good.
don't know.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Long.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Kenny, Senator Titus, can you tell us about the funding source? Are you strictly looking at a source, or will you be discussing also the amount of money needed? And can you comment on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the task force itself, we have not had any discussions about funding, but the short answer is the charge is both. And so, you know, I think the starting point for that discussion will be the increased funding levels we put in 2302. And so that was about 35 million additional baseline. And I think we need to have a discussion about, you know, we split that about in half between new water plan programs and then the municipal support. I think we need to look at that, make sure we have the right balance there, and then take a look at the needs of each. So we'll start there and decide, is this enough going forward? Maybe where is a happy medium? I would expect on that probably a soft recommendation. I don't know if we'll be able to put an exact dollar figure on that because it's hard to quantify the needs. But we'll look at that and see how much we feel like is being unmet and probably give a range. And then the source discussion, I think we'll open it up and talk, you know, there have been ideas about dedicated sales tax in the past. Maybe you do a fee on bottled water. You know, there was discussion for a long time. There are fees that feed into that from water users and ag users. Those haven't been raised in a long time, and the argument had always been, well, the state has not funded the water plan for a long time, and so it doesn't seem fair to raise fees until the state has done their part. But by the time we finish 2302, we'll more than have made up for the entire deficit and added some in. So I think we can have that discussion. Not that that's what we will recommend, but I think we have to look at the totality of everything and what do we want to accomplish and who's impacting it. And I would expect some sort of package recommendation to come out to get at it from different angles. Unless we want to undo all of the sports gambling fund and shift that to water, which I'm happy to visit with you about.
So to piggyback off of that, will you ask, depending on what projects are selected to work on, will you ask communities or landowners or whatever to chip in?
Yeah, I think that is an angle that has come up. So in some offline discussions, Texas has a kind of a unique model of how they plan with their new water plan, and it's really much more bottom up. So they get together. I think sometimes they use basins, but you could use other measures by counties, whatever made sense depending on whether it's groundwater or surface water driven. But you put together your local stakeholder group, and we have similar mechanisms with our RACs, things like that, but they don't operate the same way in Kansas. But so they get together those same groups, and they force the counties and the cities and any water districts to be a part of these groups, and they sort of build their project list for our region. Say, these are our priorities. We need to increase water supply by this much, or we need to clean up this water supply. And then those entities all put together a list of projects. And then that goes up into their equivalent of the water office to the state water plan. And their funding is much more based. They do a lot more, instead of just straight, here's the state appropriation for this project. They have a lot more cost share, matching grants. We'll give you 80% with this low interest loan if you put in 20%. But you have to have a local sponsor, right? So to access a lot of that money, we want to do something, say in Shawnee County here, that would be like river cleanup or something. The city of Topeka would have to come forward and say, we'll sponsor this project and run it. We're willing, or we'll work with Shawnee County and we'll put in 25%, and we're asking for the state to cover 75%. I would say that was a really intriguing model to me. I think it allows us to stretch state dollars a lot farther because, again, I don't know that we can ever get to where we're paying for everything, but I think if we want to really spread those dollars out and maximize things, it does two things. Of course, it allows us to do more, but I think having that local champion ensures that we're really going to have projects that people think are important because they're going to have to take the lead and not just wait for the state to hand things out to them. So I think that'll be a very lively discussion when we get to it.
Representative Roth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just think it would be a really interesting number to see how much state dollars are being spent on all the different water entities, as well as all the federal dollars that are coming down for water, for conservation, for studying water. I know that I did just a little study on it last year during our Ag Committee, and it was up around, I just first blush, around 97 million coming out of different sources, and then how many different agencies, or there could be, let's say out in Hays, Kansas, Hays could have their own water task force. I just think it'd be interesting to know how many different entities are studying water in Kansas, and how much money is being spent on studying water in Kansas from both federal and state. I don't think you'll have that number off the top of your head, and I'm not asking for that, but Madam Chair, I think that would be something that this whole committee would be interested in having, just knowing how many different entities are involved with water study, and then what's the total dollar amount, both federal and state. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Is that something KLRD could find for us?
Hi, Madam Chair, Molly Pratt with Legislative Research Department. I can look into that and see if we can find how many entities are investigating or looking into the water resources in Kansas, or water plans in Kansas.
And then the state, total for state funding and total for federal funding. So we see all the money that comes in. Yeah. And so at one point I was told, I believe there were 16 different agencies that water touches in 3 big committees, 3 big departments. And so, yeah, it's pretty important. Any other questions for Senator Titus? Okay, I did have one about, like cost share, local sponsors, and now it's escaped me. Oh, so who's going to look at the projects that are out there and decide what's number one priority, what's number two, what's number three? And are you going to try to pick things in all parts of the state so no one feels left out? How's that going to happen?
So that'll be part of our discussion this year when we look at how we're doing our planning and prioritizing. It's finding the right system to decide how we're going to do that. And, you know, one of the options in watching the work group a little bit is they're really sort of in Western states, there are two approaches to a water plan. One is sort of like, these are our general goals, right? We want to stop groundwater declines, we want to increase water quality, and maybe you flesh that out a little bit with, you know, we should encourage these types of projects. And that's typically what Kansas's water plan has looked like. Other states, though, historically have something that looks, and you've probably heard this comparison from the governor, looks more like a KDOT project list. And so part of the discussion we'll be having with the work group, I think, is what do we want? Do we want to stay how we are? Do we want that water plan to be more specific where we can plug projects in that match up priorities, or some sort of hybrid between the two, right? There's some flexibility there. So that's very much the discussion we need to have to give direction. One thing that comes up to the point of the spending is, how do we make it clear? I assume, so we worked on Senate Ag, we worked through most of this, we worked through all the water plan fund budgets as well at kind of a subcommittee. And I suspect you struggle with the same thing we do, especially if you don't live in this world all the time, is you don't really get to look at the state water plan as one big pot of money, right? It's all split into agencies. So I think there's, whether that has to be a reorganization to make that clearer, or is there a way we could distribute state water plan fund money in a way that allows legislators to get that transparency that would make it easier to balance, well, we want this part in quality and we need this part for quantity and this part for municipal support. How do we shift that around? And so that's another thing that we need to have discussion on with the task force is, what can we do to make sure legislators can see how that money moves instead of it being sort of scattered? And it's not, you know, it's just the way the system grew up over the decades. And now that we're putting, you know, when you're putting $8 million in, it's maybe not as big a deal, but when you're putting 35 million in, all of a sudden the need for that clarity really steps up.
Ranking Carlin.
As, Madam Chair, as a follow-up to that, or what it made me think of is we have legislating to do here. We have projects come before us, and we make a decision to recommend to somebody to fund something. It still goes through that process. And I'm just not sure what your task forces can do or should do to recommend those to us before. I mean, for example, the Wichita project that we're talking about, and also even the project we had at Keats, where there was an emergency, and I know Leo Henning came in one time, said 30 towns had water that was about to fail. I mean, those things happen. So what do you feel your role, your task force group's role is in recommending to us or knowing about what we're going to spend your money on? Is there some communication on that, or just
Yeah,
have
no,
to figure it out?
that's one of our main discussion points, and it's, you know, the task force isn't going to do that, but we're going to recommend changes to the planning process so that right now I don't think we're getting those recommendations in a way that it's easily quantifiable, just like you mentioned, right? I think whatever reforms we make, we need to be able to have those items coming to the legislature in a way that we can identify the projects and move forward with them. I think it'll be a hybrid of the agency will sort of set things up, but I don't think we're at a position where we want to give up all of that direct budgeting control either. So I think it'll be a mix, but we need a clearer list of not just, I think maybe just speaking for myself, not the task force, you know, when you're appropriating these, it can be frustrating to say, well, let's put in $1 million for contamination remediation. But what does that mean, right? And it means something at an agency, and they have a list and they work through it, but we're not seeing those recommendations. We don't see those results come as clearly through. And so we have to make sure we have a body or a department or something that's making that really clear what we're funding and what it goes to.
Representative Rogers.
Thank you. Apologize for being late, but I think I heard it yesterday too. No. I've lived this, so I just want to make sure, you know, no. Maybe I can answer. I'm also in the task force. And this was, we kind of shepherded this thing through last year, and the reason why it's different, I believe, than past ones, because the legislature is I hopefully more involved, kind of leading this thing. Doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or Democratic governor, they make suggestions. People write the checks, as you say, Representative. I mean, we're the appropriators, House and Senators. And so the idea was to really have something that can stick and really work long-term, get fellow legislators. And so I think, and I'm not sure if you may mention briefly, but, you know, part of that task force, I mean, we're talking with you know, City of Wichita is heavily involved, Water One, Johnson County, irrigators, agriculture, water committee members from all stripes. And so it has been one that this first year has been, you know, I would say the plan is still very much a blank sheet of paper, as it should be. And I think what you found is that members of the task force came in with an open mind, which is kind of one thing I wanted, was that we didn't have somebody come grinding in saying, well, this is my top priority right now. I think part of it, you know, as Senator Titus said, when we get done with our final report, I am hoping that we do kind of have a package of things, both probably in the House and Senate, that will happen. And one of those is probably a structure of water. We haven't got there yet. And again, this is not targeting any of the 13, 15, 16, however many people really touch water. As I go out and talk about this and talk to my constituents, you know, we have so many different entities, figure like a bucket of water. Everybody gets their hand to get a part of that water. By the time you get to the end, you don't have much left. And so that's where I think there's going to have to be a lot of collaboration, cooperation, and probably look at some of those things, because you have, you know, there are some distinct roads to go down on water, but the bottom line is we all have it. And so, and funding, my idea is I think it's everybody's responsibility. I think it should be paid out of state general fund because everybody has a piece in it. We just eliminated sales tax on food not very long ago. People are still kind of confused on that. We have 14,000 different tax bills right now to get rid or to add. I don't know if the appetite will be in the next legislature if they want to do a sales tax to help pay for this, or some sort of excise tax or whatever. I would be leery of simply doing user tax on irrigators. But I think that's where you start. But I guess I look at it, again, for right now, as we piece all these things together, is that the task force, they're coming together to put basically the onus back on the legislature to say, okay, legislature, you're the appropriators. How do we move on from here? Is it 40? Is it 70? Is it 170? But I do agree with Senator Titus is, I think we've seen success with the last couple of transportation programs and kind of setting things up like that. So and there was some tweaks there as well. So, you know, as far as in transportation and trying to get some of those things done. So it's going to be a matter of not necessarily, we don't want a water czar per se. We don't want somebody, an individual, be they appointed or by the legislature or the governor, whoever that is, that would be the thumbs up, thumbs down. But also sometimes, as we have heard, probably many of us have from our constituents, if have any sort of situation with water, dealing with water rights or whatever, you don't know which group to go to. And that's one of the frustrating parts is when that many years ago, a representative, he had an 800 and some page bill that waited till almost the last day of this, you know, to get this thing going. He had all the answers, which was fine, but didn't share it to try to gain momentum. And so I think that's where I'm hoping that, but by this discussion, we've had great turnout at these meetings. I mean, a lot of folks are interested, a lot of folks are watching online. And so I think what I would say is if, you know, you notice the water, because the other thing we're taking is water quality is a big thing. You know, this isn't a focus on one thing or the other. And so for what it's worth, I think all those questions are legitimate, but But I think, I hope it's something that will work. And as I said the other day, he's hard act to follow. It's hard to follow an attorney, because I didn't have a big enough shovel to, no. But, you know, as we look at moving forward, I mean, I said, I don't want this to be in a three-ring binder, something you can close and put up on the shelf and say, yep, there's our water plan, but something that's an actually working, breathing document. Because the legislature knows that it's important and we continue to tweak that. So that's, I guess, sorry, Madam Chair, I don't mean to pontificate on that, but that's, I guess, from, of course, I mean to pontificate, no, but, you know, as we look at moving forward, and we have a good group that participates and brings, you know, their knowledge, and I think it's, we've had some interesting conversations, probably just as much on the sidelines as anything. So just wanted to give you that insight. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions for Senator Titus on the Water Task Force? Seeing none, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for the update. Anyone else from water? I see several of you sitting in the gallery. Does anyone have any additional comments?
Sure, thank you.
You're welcome. I would like to have Connie come up because explain 3 versus 11 or 16 that I have heard about. And we're talking about how many different budgets or agencies water touches.
Thank you. Connie Owen, Director of the Kansas Water Office. And in the process that Representative Rogers referred to a few years ago when Representative Heinlein, the first chair of the House Water Committee, when he began his informational presentations for his committee, he asked that Legislative Research create a chart showing all the agencies that deal with water. And when you look at it that way, it was a page full of bubbles called the bubble chart. And yes, it just was overwhelming. It looked like there were so many. Actually, there are many whose work is impacted by water. There are many whose work impacts water. But when you talk about water management of this by the state, there are 3. And KDHE is in charge of water quality. They do permitting, regulating, and enforcement of all things water quality. The Kansas Department of Agriculture has the Division of Water Resources. They are the water rights people, the water supply, water quantity people. They also have the Division of Conservation, which impacts water issues. But that is also the second agency, the Division of Water Resources, the water rights people. They are regulatory, they do permitting, they do enforcement. The third agency is the Kansas Water Office. We do not permit, we do not regulate, we do not enforce. We are the policy and planning arm for the state of Kansas. The Water Office itself, created in the 80s, was a retooling of a previous entity that was called the Water Resources Board, that was created to be the coordinating agency and the lead agency for water policy and water management for the state. So there's an old graphic in a 1966 report by the Water Resources Board that shows the spokes of a wagon wheel, right? And in the center of the wagon wheel was the Water Resources Board, and all the spokes were everybody else, water quality, water quantity, blah, blah. The Water Office is the most recent iteration of that. So we create the Kansas Water Plan. We do that with input from all the other agencies, state, federal. We take in local entities of interest. We take public comments. And ultimately, that's approved by our advisory board, the Water Authority. We have, as I said, the advisory board that's made up of appointees by the governor and the legislature to help advise policy and suggest how the water plan is spent. The Water Office also has our public water supply entity, our charge that we have contracts with the federal reservoirs for the use of water. The federal government owns the reservoirs, the state owns storage through the Water Office, and then we have contracts with entities and communities to use water for their public drinking water. So there are three. We have the water quality people, basically the water rights people, plus conservation, and the Water Office, which is policy and planning and coordination. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That's very helpful in my brain. Representative Roth.
May I help with your brain? So,
Absolutely.
so where does the water portion of the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks bucket fit?
That's a very good question. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks is one of those entities, one of those agencies whose work impacts and is impacted by water management. And in fact, in the State Water Plan Fund, which, as you've heard, the State Water Plan Fund was created to fund things that are recommended by the water plan. Because different agencies have different expertise, some of that money goes to the Department of Agriculture, some of that money goes to Health and Environment, some of that money is with the Water Office. There are a couple that go elsewhere. One line goes to the Department of Wildlife and Parks for their aquatic nuisance species program. Another line goes to the Kansas Geological Survey for some work that they do. Those are the only two exceptions under the state water plan.
All right,
Or a
thank you.
water plan fund, excuse me.
Yeah, thank you, because I thought there was something like stream remediation or something about the water banks on the streams and then dam inspections and, I mean, you get all of these different things going on. In my small mind, it gets relatively confusing, and so that was the point of my question, because you said there were only 3 buckets, but then I was thinking, well, I thought there was Wildlife and Parks that had their bucket, and maybe one other that has a bucket, and then probably within KDA and the 3 you mentioned, there's lots of little buckets that goes there.
I'm sorry if I don't mean to interrupt.
No, I'm done. Thank you.
When dealing with water issues, partners are essential. There's almost nothing we can do on any water issue without partners, whether they're different agencies or they're local entities or they're the federal government or they're nonprofits. Almost everything that has to happen regarding water requires partners. And so that's where some of these other agencies fold in, that some of the work they do can be a partnership with one of the, for lack of a better term, the big 3. But when it comes to management decisions and policy making and enforcement and regulation, it's the 3.
Thank you so much for that answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Connie. Any other questions about water today? Seeing none, it's 2:25. We are adjourned. And one reminder about Monday, 2 o'clock is the meeting to start. So we'll see you all Monday.